Some stories begin with gunfire. This one begins with hunger. In the bitter winter of 1878, a mother named Abigail stood at the edge of despair with her little girl beside her and nothing left but love. When she gave her child the last piece of bread and lied that she was full, a hardened cowboy watching from the trees broke down in silence. But he did not know that this small moment of sacrifice would lead him into the greatest battle of his life.
The wind had teeth that morning. It didn't just blow, it bit. It was December in the Texas Highlands, 1878, and the sky was the color of a wet slate whetstone. Cold, hard, unforgiving. Silas Thorne sat atop his bay mare, Rosie, at the edge of Driftwood Creek. He wasn't looking for trouble, and he wasn't looking for company. He was looking for a reason to keep moving. Since the winter of '72, when the fever took his wife and his boy, Silas had lived in the silence of his own head. It was a quiet place, but it was lonely. Then he saw her. She was standing outside Grady's general store. She was thin, so thin she looked like a ribbon of smoke caught in a gale. Her coat was a rag. Her boots were split at the seams. Beside her stood a girl, no more than 6 years old, clutching the woman's skirt with knuckles gone white from the frost. Silas watched from the shadows of the livery stable. He saw the woman go inside. He saw her come out a minute later, shoved by the shoulder by old man Grady. "No credit for drifters," Grady yelled, his voice cracking in the cold. "I've got a business to run, not a poorhouse." The woman didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just stood there for a second, her back as straight as a lodgepole pine. She looked down at the girl, tucked a stray hair behind the child's ear, and started walking. She walked away from the town toward the open trail where the wind whipped the hardest. Silas didn't know why he followed. Maybe it was the way she carried herself. Maybe it was the girl. He kept Rosie at a slow walk, staying back 100 yards. He tracked them like he would a wounded deer, but there was no blood in the snow, only the shallow, uneven prints of worn-out leather. 2 miles out, the woman stopped. There was a hollowed-out oak tree near the bend of the creek, a skeleton of a thing that offered a scrap of shelter. She sat the girl down in the roots. Silas dismounted. He moved through the brush on foot, quiet as a cat. He crouched behind a cedar brake, close enough to hear the world break. The girl was shivering. It was a deep, rhythmic shaking. "Mama," the child whispered, "I'm so empty it hurts." The woman, Abigail, reached into the deep pocket of her frayed coat. Her hands were shaking too. She pulled out a small gray object. It was a crust of bread, a single hard, moldy heel of a biscuit that most men wouldn't feed to a dog. "Here, Maggie," Abigail said. Her voice was a low hum, steady as a hymn. "I found this in my bag. I already had my share while you were napping in the wagon yesterday. This is for you." "Are you sure, Mama?" "I'm full to the brim, sugar. Eat. Every crumb is a bit of strength." Silas watched Abigail's face. She wasn't looking at the bread. She was looking at the horizon, her jaw set tight. He watched her swallow hard, her throat working over nothing but air. She was starving. He could see it in the hollows of her cheeks, the way her skin clung to her delicate jawbone. The girl took the crust. She ate it like it was gold. She licked the dust from her fingers. Abigail watched her with a look of such raw, agonizing love that Silas felt a sharp crack in his chest. It was a sacrifice, a quiet, holy thing happening in the middle of a wasteland. Silas turned his head away. He leaned his forehead against the cold bark of a cedar tree. And then the tears came. He didn't sob. He didn't make a sound. But the tears ran hot over his wind-burned face, carving paths through the dust and the grit. He wept for the boy he couldn't save. He wept for the cruelty of a man like Grady. He wept because in a world this big, a mother had to lie about her own hunger just to keep her child's heart beating for 1 more hour. He wiped his eyes with his sleeve. He took a breath. The air felt different now. It felt like a requirement. He stepped out from the brush. Abigail scrambled to her feet. She pushed the girl behind her. She didn't have a knife or a gun, but she held her hands out like she was ready to tear the world apart to protect that child. Stay back, she said. Her voice was sharp. It was a warning. Silas held up his hands, palms open. He stayed 6 feet away. I mean you no harm, ma'am. My name is Silas Thorne. I have a ranch 3 miles up that ridge. We aren't looking for charity, she snapped. Her pride was a shield. It was the only thing she had left. Silas looked her square in the eye. He didn't look down. Ma'am, I'm not offering charity. Charity is a word people use when they want to feel better than the person they're helping. I'm offering a trade. I'm offering a job. Abigail didn't move. A job doing what? I have a house that's forgotten what a broom looks like. I have a kitchen that hasn't seen a hot meal in years. And I have a ranch that needs a woman's eyes to make it a home again. I need a housekeeper. The pay is 3 meals a day, a warm bed, and a wage. And I have an empty room for the girl. Abigail searched his face. She was looking for the catch. She was looking for the darkness that lived in many men out here. Silas spoke again, his voice grounding the moment. Before you say no, I want you to hear me. I watched you back there. I saw you give that child your last bit of food. Abigail stiffened. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do, Silas said. And here is what I believe, ma'am. This is the truth as I see it. Every human being has an inherent God-given right to dignity and a full stomach. No person should ever be forced to beg for a crust of bread while others have silos full of grain. It is a failure of our society, not a failure of your character, that you are sitting under this tree. He paused, letting the wind carry the weight of his words. Injustice happens when we stop seeing the person in front of us and start seeing a drifter or a beggar. I see a mother. I see a woman who has done everything right in a world that's gone wrong. And I am telling you, you have a right to a roof over your head that no law or judge can rightfully take away. Abigail's eyes softened just a fraction. The girl, Maggie, peeked out from behind her mother's skirts. Is there bread at your house, mister? Silas felt that crack in his chest again. There is, little bit. Flour, lard, and jam. And a stove that stays hot all night. Abigail looked at Maggie. Then she looked back at Silas. She saw the dried tracks of tears on his face. She saw that he wasn't a predator. He was a man who had been hollowed out by the same world that was trying to crush her. I can cook, she said quietly, and I can clean. But I will not be a servant. I will be an employee. Silas nodded. You will be a partner in keeping that ranch running. And Maggie will have time for her lessons. A child's education is a sacred thing. It's the only way we ensure the next generation doesn't end up as cruel as the men in that town. Abigail took a step forward. She didn't reach for his hand yet. She just stood there, breathing. Why are you doing this, Mr. Thorne? Silas looked at the bay mare waiting patiently behind him. Because, ma'am, we have a moral obligation to one another. Life is hard enough without us turning our backs on a neighbor in need. If I have a loaf of bread and you have none, that half of that loaf belongs to you by the simple law of human compassion. To keep it all for myself would be a theft of your right to survive. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a heavy wool blanket. He stepped forward and handed it to her. Wrap the girl, he said. Rosie can carry both of you. I'll walk. Abigail took the blanket. She wrapped Maggie tight. The girl sighed, a sound of pure relief that hurt to hear. Abigail looked at Silas, her eyes shimmering with something that wasn't quite hope yet. But it was close. My name is Abigail Sterling, she said. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Sterling, Silas replied. He took the mare's reins. Let's get home. The sun's going down, and the cold doesn't care about our introductions. As they started up the trail, Silas looked back once at the town of Driftwood Creek. The lights were flickering in the windows of comfortable homes. He thought about Grady and the men like him. He thought about the crust of bread. He realized then that he wasn't just saving Abigail. By speaking the truth out loud, by acknowledging her right to exist and her right to be respected, he was saving the part of himself that had died in '72. "Kindness isn't a gift, Abigail," he said as they walked, his voice rhythmic and steady against the crunch of snow. "It is a debt we owe to the rest of the world. I'm just starting to pay mine." They disappeared into the gray light of the highlands, three souls moving toward a hearth that had been cold for far too long. The wind still bit, but for the first time in 6 winters, Silas Thorne didn't feel the chill in his bones. He felt the warmth of a purpose, and that, he knew, was the only thing that could truly keep a man alive. The ranch sat on a high spine of rock and timber. Blackwood Ridge, Silas called it. The house was built of cedar and stone. It looked like it had grown right out of the earth. It was sturdy. It was honest. But as the door creaked open, the smell hit Abigail. It was the scent of a man who had stopped caring about the world inside his own walls. Dust, old ash, the cold, stagnant air of a tomb. Silas stepped inside first. He lit a kerosene lamp. The yellow light pushed back the shadows. It revealed a room that was functional but barren. A heavy oak table, a stone fireplace that took up half the wall, a few chairs with worn-out seats. "It isn't a palace," Silas said. He stayed by the door. He didn't want to crowd her. "But the roof doesn't leak, and the walls are thick enough to keep the wind where it belongs." Abigail walked to the center of the room. She held Maggie's hand. The girl was looking at the fireplace. She was looking for the promise of heat. "It is more than we had this morning," Abigail said. Her voice was quiet. She was tired. She was so tired her bones felt like they were made of glass. Silas reached into his pocket. He pulled out a heavy piece of iron. It was a key. It was jagged and old, but it shone in the lamplight. He walked toward a door at the end of a short hallway. He pushed it open to reveal a small, clean bedroom. There was a bed with a thick mattress, a washstand, a window looking out toward the pines. He handed the key to Abigail. He made sure his hand didn't touch hers. He wanted to give her space. "This is your room," Silas said. "Yours and the girls. There is a bolt on the inside. This key works on the outside. When you go in there, that door stays locked. It stays locked until you decide to open it." Abigail looked at the iron in her palm. It felt heavy. It felt like a mountain. "Why are you giving me this?" Silas leaned against the doorframe. He looked at her with a steady gaze. "I am giving it to you because every human being deserves sovereignty over their own body and their own space," he said. His voice was rhythmic. It was like a hammer hitting a soft nail. "In this world, Abigail, women are often treated like property, like something to be owned or used. But here, you are your own master. This key is a symbol. It means that your privacy is a right, not a favor. It means you have the power to say no, and have that no be the law of the land." Abigail swallowed. She had spent years in a world where her no was an invitation to an argument, or worse. She looked at the bed. She looked at Maggie, who was already sitting on the edge of the quilt, her eyes drooping. "Respect is not something you should have to earn," Silas continued. "It is the baseline of how we live. If we don't respect the boundaries of the person next to us, we aren't much better than the wolves out on the ridge. You are an employee here, not a servant. And an employee has a right to a safe harbor." Abigail sat down on the bed next to her daughter. She felt the softness of the mattress. She felt the weight of the key in her hand. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." "Call me Silas," he said. "The mister makes me feel like a man with a ledger. I've had enough of ledgers." He left them then. He went into the kitchen. Abigail heard the sound of wood being chopped. She heard the clatter of a cast-iron stove. She heard the roar of a fire coming to life. She didn't move for a long time. She just sat there in the silence. She realized that for the first time in years her heart wasn't racing. The panic that usually lived under her ribs had gone quiet. She got up and walked to the hallway. She looked into the main room. Silas was standing by the stove. He wasn't looking at her. He was stirring a pot of beans. But on the far wall, Abigail saw something that made her breath catch. A bookshelf. It was tall. It was filled. Leather-bound spines, cloth covers. Some were worn. Some looked new. She walked toward it. Her fingers traced the guy of a book. Jane Eyre. Charlotte Bronte. Silas turned his head. He saw her looking. "Help yourself," he said. "Books are like bread. They're meant to be shared. If a man keeps all the stories to himself, his mind gets as narrow as a goat path." Abigail pulled the book from the shelf. She opened it. The smell of old paper and ink filled her lungs. It was the smell of her father's office. It was the smell of a life she thought was gone forever. "Education is a human right, Silas," she said. She turned toward him. Her eyes were bright. "People think that books are a luxury. They think that learning is for the rich, but they are wrong. A person who can read can think for themselves. A person who can think for themselves cannot be easily enslaved by the lies of others. To deny a person an education is to deny them their own mind." Silas nodded. He poured a cup of coffee and handed it to her. It was hot. It was bitter. It was perfect. "That is the truth," Silas said. "The men in town, the men like Grady, they want people to stay ignorant. Ignorant people are easy to frighten, and frightened people are easy to control. They want you to believe that your worth is tied to your bank account. But your worth is tied to your humanity, and your humanity is fueled by what you know." They stood there for a moment. The fire crackled. The wind howled against the cedar walls. But inside there was a different kind of strength. "Go to sleep, Abigail," Silas said. "Tomorrow is a long day. We have work to do. But tonight you're safe and you are free. Those two things should always go together." Abigail went back into her room. She tucked Maggie in. She locked the door. She didn't lock it because she was afraid of Silas. She locked it because she had the right to do so. She lay down and watched the moonlight crawl across the floor. She realized that she wasn't just a drifter anymore. She was a person with a key. And in 1878, in the Texas highlands, that was everything. The sun came up cold. It was a pale yellow eye peeking over the edge of the mountains. But inside the house at Blackwood Ridge, the air was warm. Abigail was in the kitchen before Silas woke. She had the stove humming. She had biscuits in the oven. She had found a jar of honey and a slab of salt pork. When Silas walked in, he stopped. He looked at the table. He looked at the steam rising from the coffee pot. He looked at Maggie, who was sitting in a chair with her hair brushed, swinging her legs. "I haven't smelled breakfast like this in a decade," Silas said. He sat down. He looked like a man who was seeing a ghost, a good ghost. "It is part of the trade," Abigail said. She set a plate in front of him. "A man cannot work on an empty stomach, and a house cannot be a home without a hearth." They ate in silence for a while. The food was simple, but it was plenty, and plenty was a miracle. After breakfast, Silas stood up. "I have to check the stock. The wind was high last night. Sometimes the horses get spooked and break a rail. Maggie, do you want to see the horses?" The girl's eyes lit up. She looked at her mother. Abigail nodded. They went out into the barn. It was a cavernous place. It smelled of hay and leather and the warm musk of animals. Silas had 3 horses, a bay, a roan, and a dappled gray. He walked over to the bay, Rosie. He stroked her nose. He spoke to her in a low, rhythmic tone. Maggie watched him. She reached out a small hand. Silas guided her. He showed her how to touch the horse's neck. He showed her how to stay calm. "We are stewards of these lives, Maggie," Silas said. He looked down at the child. "Some men think that because an animal cannot speak, it has no feelings. They think that because they are stronger, they have the right to be cruel. But they are wrong. Power does not give a person the right to be a tyrant. Power gives a person the responsibility to be a protector." Maggie patted the horse's flank. Rosie exhaled a cloud of steam. Every living thing has a right to be treated with compassion, Silas continued. An animal serves us, but it is not a slave. It is a partner. If we treat a horse with violence, we break its spirit. And a man who breaks the spirit of another living thing is breaking a part of his own humanity. We owe these animals a debt of care for the work they do for us. Abigail stood in the doorway. She watched Silas. She saw the way his hands moved. They were calloused. They were rough, but they were gentle. She realized that Silas Thorne didn't just talk about dignity. He lived it. He lived it in the way he treated his stock. He lived it in the way he treated a 6-year-old girl. "Compassion isn't a weakness, Silas," Abigail said. She walked into the barn. "People out here think that you have to be hard to survive. They think that kindness is for people back east. But the opposite is true. It takes a lot of strength to be kind in a hard world. It takes no strength at all to be cruel. Cruelty is the easy path for the small-minded." Silas looked up at her. He gave a small, grim smile. "You have a way with words, Abigail. You sound like a lawyer." "I was a legal clerk," she said. "I spent my days reading the law. I spent my days watching men try to bend the law to fit their own greed. I learned that the law is only as good as the people who uphold it. If the heart is rotten, the law becomes a weapon." Later that afternoon, Abigail set up a small table by the window. She had found a slate and some chalk in a drawer. She sat Maggie down. It was time for lessons. Silas came in from the cold. He stood by the fire, warming his hands. He watched Abigail point to the letters on the slate. "Why is it so important to you?" Silas asked. "The schooling? Most girls out here just learn to sew and cook and wait for a husband." Abigail looked at him. Her face was set. "Because Maggie is a person, Silas. She is not a shadow. And a person has a right to their own agency. If she cannot read, she has to rely on what others tell her. If she cannot write, she has no voice in the world. I want her to have the tools to build her own life, not just live the one that is handed to her." She turned back to Maggie. "A, B, C, she said. Maggie repeated them. "Education is the great equalizer," Abigail said to Silas. "A poor girl who can read is more powerful than a rich man who is blind to the truth. In this country, we talk about liberty, but there is no liberty without knowledge. A person who is kept in the dark is never truly free. They are just wandering in a larger cage." Silas sat down in the chair by the fire. He watched the lesson. He saw the way Maggie's face lit up when she got a letter right. He saw the way Abigail's voice softened with patience. "I want to learn too," Silas said suddenly. Abigail looked up. She was surprised. "You can read, Silas. I saw your books." "I can read the words," Silas said. His voice was thick. "But I never learned the deeper meaning. I never learned the history. I never learned the why of things. I spent my life working the land. I spent my life looking at the ground. I want to look at the stars for a while. Every person has a right to grow, no matter how old they are. To stop learning is to start dying." Abigail smiled. It was a real smile. It reached her eyes. "Then we will learn together. We will start tonight." That evening, after Maggie was asleep, the house was quiet. Silas and Abigail sat at the oak table. The kerosene lamp cast a warm, golden circle on the wood. They had Jane Eyre open between them. Abigail read a passage. Then they talked about it. "She wants to be independent," Silas said. He was leaning forward. "Even when she has nothing, she refuses to let her spirit be crushed. She insists on her own value as a human being." "Exactly," Abigail said. "She says, 'I am no bird, and no net ensnares me. I am a free human being with an independent will.' That is the core of what it means to be alive, Silas. To have a will that is your own. To recognize that your soul does not belong to any man, no matter how much money or power he has." They talked late into the night. They talked about the rights of the poor. They talked about the responsibility of the strong. They talked about the beauty of a world where people looked out for one another. Abigail realized that the silence in the house had changed. It wasn't the silence of a tomb anymore. It was the silence of a library. It was the silence of a sanctuary. "We are building something here, Silas," Abigail said as she stood up to go to her room. "It isn't just a ranch. It's a place where we acknowledge the truth that everyone deserves a seat at the table, the truth that mercy is the highest law." Silas looked at her. He stood up too. "Then we will keep building," he said. "We will keep the fire going, and we will keep the door open for the truth. Because the truth is the only thing that can truly set us free." Abigail went to her room. She turned the key. But for the first time, she didn't feel like she was locking the world out. She felt like she was locking the peace in. She lay down and listened to the rhythmic breathing of her daughter. She knew that the road ahead would be hard. She knew that Judge Miller and the men like him would eventually come looking. But she also knew that she wasn't alone anymore. She was part of a stewardship. And on Blackwood Ridge, that was enough to face the winter. The air in Driftwood Creek didn't smell like the ridge. Up on the mountain, the air was sharp. It was clean. It tasted like pine needles and the coming snow. But in town, it smelled like coal smoke and old greed. It smelled like people living too close together and caring too little about one another. We made the trip in the buckboard 3 weeks after Abigail arrived. We needed flour, we needed salt, and Maggie needed a pair of boots that weren't held together by hope and twine. I didn't want to go. I liked the silence of the high country. But a man can't eat silence, and a growing girl needs leather between her and the frost. As we pulled onto Main Street, the rhythm of the town changed. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. I saw Old Man Grady standing in front of his store, his arms crossed over his apron. He looked at Abigail like she was a stain he couldn't scrub off the floor. But it wasn't Grady I was worried about. A black carriage sat in front of the courthouse. It was polished. It was heavy. It belonged to Judge Miller. Miller wasn't just a judge. He was the law, the bank, and the conscience of the valley, at least the conscience he thought we all should have. He was a man who believed that the world was a ladder, and he was the only one allowed to hold the rungs. We stepped onto the boardwalk. Abigail kept her head up. She didn't look at the dirt. She looked at the horizon. "Silas," a voice called out. It was dry. It sounded like parchment rubbing together. Judge Miller stepped out of the shadows of the apothecary. He was dressed in black broadcloth. His mustache was trimmed to a precise line. He looked at me. Then his eyes slid to Abigail. They stayed there. They were cold eyes. They were the eyes of a man who measured the world in property and vagrancy statutes. "I hear you've taken in a guest, Silas," Miller said. He leaned on a silver-headed cane. "A woman and a child, drifters, from what I gather." I felt the heat rise in my neck. "They are employees, Judge. Mrs. Sterling is my housekeeper. Maggie is my ward." Miller chuckled. It wasn't a happy sound. "Silas, you were always a man of soft heart and hard head," he said. He stepped closer, the tap of his cane rhythmic on the boards. "But you must understand the nature of our community. A town is a delicate machine. It requires order. It requires people who belong, to bring in those without roots, without a husband to vouch for them. It invites chaos. The law looks unfavorably on those who harbor vagrants." Abigail stepped forward. She didn't wait for me to speak. She didn't look for my permission. "Judge Miller," she said. Her voice was calm. It was steady. "I am familiar with the vagrancy laws of this territory, and I am familiar with the Bill of Rights. A person does not become a vagrant simply because they are poor. A person becomes a vagrant when they have no means of support and no intent to work. I have both." Miller's eyebrows shot up. He wasn't used to women talking back, especially women in faded cotton dresses. "Is that so?" Miller sneered. "It is," Abigail continued. "And I believe you should hear this for the sake of the office you hold. The law is not a weapon to be used by the powerful to prune the branches of the poor. It is a shield designed to protect the weak from the whims of men like you. To suggest that I need a man to vouch for my character is to suggest that I am not a citizen in my own right. And that, Judge, is a legal fallacy that the Constitution does not support. The boardwalk went silent. Grady leaned out of his door. A couple of teamsters stopped their horses to listen. Abigail didn't stop. Every human being has a right to their own agency. We are not livestock to be branded by our associations. If I work, if I pay my way, and if I follow the peace, then the law owes me its protection, not its suspicion. To treat a woman as a ward of the state simply because she is independent is a violation of the very liberty this country claims to cherish. Miller's face went a dark shade of plum. He gripped his cane so hard his knuckles went white. You have a sharp tongue, woman. But remember this, the law in these parts is what I say it is. And I say that a woman without a master is a problem looking for a place to happen. He turned and walked toward his carriage. The tap, tap, tap of his cane was like a warning. I looked at Abigail. She was breathing hard, but she didn't look afraid. She looked like she had just won a battle she had been fighting her whole life. That was dangerous, Abigail, I said quietly as we walked toward the general store. Silence is more dangerous, Silas, she replied. If we allow men like Miller to rewrite the rules of humanity to fit their own comfort, then we have already lost our freedom. We have a moral obligation to speak the truth to power, even when our voices shake. Because if we don't, the truth eventually dies of neglect. We bought the boots for Maggie. We bought the flour. But as we rode back up Blackwood Ridge, the shadow of the town followed us. I knew Miller wouldn't forget. A man like that thrives on being feared. And Abigail had just shown the whole town that he was nothing more than a man with a fancy suit and a hollow heart. He'll come for us, I said. Abigail looked at Maggie, who was fast asleep against her shoulder. Let him come, Silas. We are standing on the ground of the truth. And that is the only ground that doesn't wash away in a storm. Winter finally arrived in earnest 2 weeks later. It came with a scream. The wind howled through the passes, and the snow piled up in drifts that could swallow a man whole. We stayed inside. We kept the fire going. We read our books. But a ranch doesn't stop just because the mercury drops. I had an old hand named Caleb, who lived in a small cabin near the south pasture. Caleb was a man of color, a former Buffalo soldier who had seen more of the world's ugliness than any one man should. He was quiet. He was hard-working. He was the only man I trusted with my stock. One Tuesday, I heard a shout from the direction of the corral. I ran out into the biting cold. I found Caleb pinned against the heavy cedar rails. A young bull, spooked by the sudden drop in temperature, had charged. Caleb had avoided the horns, but the bull's massive head had slammed him into the timber. By the time I got to him, Caleb was on the ground. The snow was turning a dark, sickening red. Silas, he gasped. He was clutching his side. His face was gray. I think the rail... It snapped. It's in me. I looked. A jagged piece of cedar had broken off the fence and was lodged deep in Caleb's hip. It was bad. It was the kind of wound that killed a man in hours. I carried him to the house. Abigail saw us coming. She didn't scream. She didn't panic. She just cleared the big oak table and started boiling water. We need a doctor, Silas, she said, her voice clipped. Go to town. Bring Dr. Pennington. I rode Rosie harder than I ever had. I made it to town in record time. I found Pennington in the saloon, nursing a glass of whiskey. I told him what happened. I told him it was Caleb. Pennington set his glass down. He looked at me with a weary, indifferent gaze. Thorne, it's a blizzard out there. And you're asking me to ride 3 miles for a man like Caleb? I froze. He's a man, Pennington. He's dying. I have a limited amount of medicine, Silas, Pennington said, his voice cold. And I have a responsibility to the citizens of this town. I'm not risking my neck in a storm for a drifter who doesn't even have a vote. Every man has a value, Silas. And in this world, some values are higher than others. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to drag him by his collar. But I knew it was no use. A man who sees the world through the lens of prejudice is blind to the Hippocratic oath. "You're a coward, Pennington," I said, "and a poor excuse for a human being. If a man's life is worth less to you because of the color of his skin, then your medicine is nothing but poison." I rode back to the ranch, my heart heavy as a stone. I walked into the house, ready to tell Caleb it was over. But the house didn't smell like death. It smelled like vinegar and herbs. Abigail was standing over the table. Her sleeves were rolled up, her hands were covered in blood. She had a pair of sewing shears and a curved needle. Maggie was standing on a stool, holding a lamp steady, her face pale but determined. "Where's the doctor?" Abigail asked without looking up. "He wouldn't come," I said. "He said Caleb wasn't worth the ride." Abigail's jaw tightened. "I expected as much. Well then, we'll have to do it ourselves." "Abigail, you can't—" "Watch me, Silas," she snapped. "I am a surgeon's daughter. I spent 10 years in my father's clinic. I have seen wounds that would make Dr. Pennington faint, and I will not let a man die because of the bigotry of a small town." For the next 4 hours, I watched a miracle. Abigail didn't just fix him, she operated. She moved with a rhythmic precision that was almost like a dance. She removed the cedar splinter. She cleaned the wound with whiskey. She stitched the torn muscle with a hand that was as steady as the ridge itself. Caleb slipped into unconsciousness, but his breathing stayed even. When the last stitch was tied, Abigail slumped into a chair. She was trembling now. The adrenaline was fading. "You saved him," I whispered. Abigail looked at me. Her eyes were weary. "I did what was right, Silas. Every person has an inherent right to medical care. To deny a person help because of their race or their status is a crime against humanity. The body doesn't know about the value Judge Miller puts on a person. The body just knows pain. And the healer's job is to address that pain, regardless of the person's history." She looked at her bloody hands. "We talk about equality in this country, but we don't practice it. We treat healthcare like a privilege for the wealthy and the white. But health is a fundamental right. To withhold it is to claim that some lives are worth more than others, and I will never accept that lie." Maggie walked over and put a small hand on her mother's arm. "You were like an angel, Mama." Abigail pulled the girl close. "No, Maggie. I was just being a human being. That's all any of us should strive for." That night, Silas sat by Caleb's bed. The storm continued to lash the house. But inside there was a quiet triumph. Caleb lived. He lived because a woman refused to accept the value the world had placed on him. "You know, Silas," Abigail said as she brought me a cup of tea, "this is why they're afraid of us. They are afraid of people who see through their labels. If we start treating everyone with the same dignity, their whole system of power falls apart. They need us to believe that some people are less so they can feel more." I looked at her. I saw the strength in her. "Then we'll keep making them afraid, Abigail. We'll keep treating people like they matter. Because on this ridge, they do." Caleb opened his eyes. He looked at Abigail. He didn't have the strength to speak, but he reached out and touched her hand. Abigail squeezed back. "You're going to be fine, Caleb. You're in a house where your life is valued, and that's the best medicine there is." As the fire burned low, I realized that Blackwood Ridge was no longer just a ranch. It was a fortress. It was a place where the laws of the town didn't apply. Here, the only law was mercy. And as long as Abigail Sterling was there, that law would never be broken. The blizzard didn't just fall, it attacked. It shoved its way through the chinking of the logs and whistled under the floorboards like a banshee looking for a place to sit. For 3 days, the world was nothing but a white wall. You couldn't see the barn from the porch. You couldn't see your own hand if you held it out too far. We were trapped. But inside the house on Blackwood Ridge, we had a different kind of weather. Maggie started coughing on the second night. It was a dry, hollow sound. Every time it rattled in her chest, I felt a cold spike drive through my own ribs. I tried to stay busy. I cleaned my rifle 3 times. I sharpened the kitchen knives until they could shave a ghost. But I couldn't stop listening to that cough. Abigail was a dervish of quiet action. She made a poultice of onions and mustard. She steeped a tea of willow bark and honey. She sat by the girl's bed, her shadow dancing on the wall in the firelight. I stood in the doorway watching them. "She'll be fine, Silas," Abigail whispered. She didn't look up. "It's just the cold. It's the damp." "I know," I said, but my voice sounded like gravel in a tin cup. I sat down in the heavy chair by the hearth. The fire was roaring, but I felt a chill that no amount of cedar wood could touch. It was the memory of 1872. It was the memory of another child, another cough, and a winter that had taken everything but my name. Abigail left the room and sat across from me. She looked at me for a long time. She saw the way my hands were gripping the arms of the chair. "Silas," she said, "you aren't here. You're back there, aren't you? In that year you don't talk about." I looked into the flames. I didn't want to say it. I'd spent 6 years building a wall around that winter. But Abigail had a way of looking through walls. "Grief is a heavy pack to carry alone, Silas," she said. Her voice was rhythmic, soft. "We think that by staying silent, we are protecting ourselves. We think that if we don't name the pain, it doesn't have a shape. But silence is just a dark room where the shadows grow larger. We have a right to our sorrow, Silas. But we also have a responsibility to share it with those who care for us." I took a breath. It felt like swallowing needles. "His name was James," I said. "He was 4. He had blue eyes like the summer sky. When the fever came, it didn't take long. He coughed just like that, and then he just stopped. My wife, Sarah, she followed him 3 days later. I buried them in the frozen ground. I had to use a pickaxe because the earth was hard as iron." I stopped. The room was quiet, save for the wind. "I thought that if I never spoke their names again, I could keep them safe," I continued. "I thought I could keep the world from touching the memory. But all I did was lock myself in a cage with the ghosts. I've been living in a tomb for 6 years, Abigail. I thought being alone was the only way to keep from being hurt again." Abigail reached out. She didn't grab my hand. She just rested her fingers on the sleeve of my coat. It was a light touch, but it felt like an anchor. "Silas, listen to me," she said. "The right to be heard is a fundamental part of being human. When we suffer in secret, we are denying our own humanity. We are treating ourselves like we don't matter. But your pain matters. Your history matters. To heal, we must be allowed to speak. Community isn't just about sharing bread and work. It's about sharing the weight of the soul." She leaned forward. The firelight caught the gray in her hair. "We talk about freedom in this country, like it's just about land and laws. But the greatest freedom is the freedom from our own isolation. You don't have to carry James and Sarah by yourself anymore. You can let them breathe in this house. You can let their memory be part of the warmth, not just part of the cold." I looked at her. I saw the tears in her eyes. And for the first time since 1872, I let my own eyes go wet. I didn't sob. I just let the water run. It felt like a thaw. It felt like the ice on the creek breaking up in the spring. "Thank you, Abigail," I whispered. "Don't thank me for being a neighbor, Silas," she replied. "We owe each other our ears and our hearts. That is the baseline of a moral life. If we see a man drowning, we throw him a rope. If we see a man drowning in his own silence, we give him our presence. That is the only way we survive the winters." We sat there for a long time. Maggie's cough slowed. She fell into a deep, easy sleep. The blizzard kept howling, but the house felt different. It felt like a home. It felt like a place where the living and the dead could coexist without fear. "Healing isn't a destination, Silas. Abigail said as she stood up to check the fire. It's a practice. It's something we choose every morning when we decide to keep going. And we choose it every evening when we decide to be honest about our scars. Scars are just proof that the world tried to break us, and we grew back stronger in the broken places. I stood up too. I felt lighter. I felt like I could breathe all the way down to my boots. I'm glad you stayed under that oak tree, Abigail. I'm glad you followed me, Silas. Even if you were just a lonely cowboy with a wet face. She smiled. It was the first time I'd seen a real smile on her face in the dark. It was better than the sun. The thaw came a week later. The snow turned to slush, and the world became a muddy gray mess. But the sun was out. It felt like a victory. We were sitting on the porch, watching Maggie throw sticks for a stray hound that had wandered up from the valley. Life felt steady. It felt like we had finally found a rhythm that the world couldn't break. But the world always tries. I saw the carriage first. It was black. It was polished. It was moving slowly up the ridge trail, the horses struggling in the mud. Behind it rode two men on horseback. I recognized Judge Miller's silver-headed cane through the window of the carriage. Abigail stood up. Her face went pale. She wiped her hands on her apron, a nervous habit she hadn't used in weeks. "He's here," she whispered. The carriage stopped in front of the house. Miller stepped out looking as sharp and cold as a winter morning. But he wasn't alone. A man stepped out after him. He was tall. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than my entire ranch. He had a gold watch chain and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He looked like a man who spent his life in parlors and gambling dens. Abigail gasped. "Julian!" The man looked up. He tipped his hat. "Abigail, my dear, you've certainly found a rustic place to hide." I stepped off the porch. I moved between them. I didn't reach for my gun, but I made sure my hand was close. "Who are you?" "Silas Thorne, I presume," the man said. His voice was smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "I am Julian Sterling, Abigail's husband, and I believe you have something of mine." I felt a surge of anger. Abigail isn't a something. She's a person, and she doesn't belong to you. Judge Miller stepped forward, tapping his cane on the wet ground. "Now, Silas, let's not be hasty. Mr. Sterling has the law on his side. He has brought papers from Missouri. He has a marriage certificate and a warrant for the return of his family. Under the law of coverture, a wife's legal existence is suspended during marriage. She belongs to the household of her husband." Abigail stepped off the porch. She was trembling, but her head was high. "Julian, you abandoned us. You left us with nothing in St. Louis. You gambled away our home and our future. I filed for a decree of abandonment." Julian laughed. It was a cold, empty sound. "And I had that decree suppressed, Abigail. You know how the system works. A few dollars in the right pockets and a woman's rights disappear like smoke." He looked at me. "Thorne, I'm a reasonable man. I hear you've been harboring my wife. That's a serious charge. It's a felony in this territory to interfere with a man's domestic rights. But Judge Miller and I have come to an agreement. If Abigail and the girl return with me today, I will drop the charges against you. And Miller will forget all about that vagrancy nonsense." I looked at Abigail. Her eyes were full of terror. She looked at Maggie, who was standing by the porch, clutching the hound's neck. "This is an outrage," I said. My voice was shaking with rage. "You can't just trade a woman like a head of cattle. This is 1878, for God's sake." Abigail stepped forward. She looked at Miller, then she looked at Julian. "Listen to me, both of you," she said. Her voice was steady now, clear. "This is the problem with your laws. You have built a system that treats half the human race like property. You call it order, but it is nothing but organized theft. To claim that a woman has no legal existence outside of her husband is to deny the very soul that God gave her. It is a violation of the fundamental principle that all people are created equal." Julian smirked. "Save the lecture for the schoolhouse, Abigail. The law is the law." "The law is a reflection of the men who write it, Julian," she snapped. "And if the law allows a man to abandon his family and then reclaim them like lost luggage, then the law is immoral. An immoral law has no authority over the human conscience. We have a right to our own lives. We have a right to be free from the tyranny of those who would own us. She looked at me. She saw the look in my eyes. She saw that I was ready to fight. She saw that I was ready to die to keep her there. And that was when she made her choice. "I will go," she said quietly. "Abigail, no," I shouted. She turned to me. She took my hands. Her grip was like iron. "Silas, look at the girl. If you fight them, Miller will take this ranch. He'll put you in prison. And then what happens to Maggie? Julian will take her anyway, and she'll have no one to protect her. If I go now, the charges against you are dropped. You keep the ridge. You stay free. And I will find a way. I always find a way." "I won't let you do this," I said. "Silas, listen to me," she said. Her voice was a whisper now. "This is the ultimate lesson of a life lived for others. Sometimes the only way to protect those we love is to sacrifice our own comfort. It is a heavy price. It is an unjust price. But it is a price I am willing to pay to ensure that Maggie has a chance, to ensure that you stay here to keep the fire going." She looked back at Miller. "I will go on one condition. You sign a paper right here, right now, stating that Silas Thorne is cleared of all charges. And you state that Maggie is to remain here under his guardianship for the remainder of the winter, until I am settled in our new home." Julian frowned. "The girl comes with us." "No," Abigail said. "She stays, or I stay, and we let Silas and his rifle decide the outcome." "Which will it be, Julian? A peaceful departure with a cooperative wife, or a bloodbath on a muddy ridge?" Julian looked at my hand on my hip. He looked at the hard set of my jaw. He saw that I was a man with nothing left to lose but the people I loved. "Fine," Julian said. "The brat stays for now. We'll send for her in the spring." Miller pulled a pen and paper from his vest. He wrote the agreement. I signed it. Julian signed it. Abigail signed it. Abigail walked over to Maggie. She knelt in the mud. She held the girl's face in her hands. "Maggie, listen to me," she said. "You stay with Silas. You do your lessons. You be brave. I'm going to go prepare a place for us. Do you understand?" "Mama, don't go," Maggie cried. "I have to, sugar. It's the only way we keep our home. But remember what I told you. No one can take your mind. No one can take your heart. You stay strong for me." Abigail stood up. She didn't look at me. I think she knew that if she looked at me, she'd never be able to leave. She climbed into the carriage. Julian followed her. He slammed the door. The carriage turned. The horses strained. I stood in the mud, holding Maggie's hand. I watched the black carriage disappear down the trail. I watched the ghosts of her past take her away. The ridge went silent. The hound whined and tucked its tail. "Silas?" Maggie whispered. "Is Mama coming back?" I looked at the girl. I looked at the legal paper in my hand. It felt like a betrayal. It felt like a piece of ash. "Yes, Maggie," I said. My voice was a growl. "She's coming back, because I'm going to get her, and this time the law isn't going to be enough to stop me." I looked at the trail. I saw the deep ruts the carriage had left in the mud. They looked like scars on the earth. "Listen to me, Maggie," I said. "We have a right to justice. Not the justice Miller talks about, but real justice. The kind that says a mother and a child belong together. The kind that says a man's greed cannot override a woman's freedom. We are going to finish your lessons, and then we are going to go to Abilene. We are going to find a lawyer who doesn't work for Miller. And we are going to bring your mother home." Maggie looked at me. Her eyes were wide. "Can we do that?" "We have to, Maggie, because if we don't stand up to the bullies, they eventually own the whole world. And I'll be damned if I let them own this ridge." I picked the girl up and carried her into the house. The fire was still burning. The books were still on the shelf. But the heart of the house was gone. "Sacrifice is a powerful thing, Maggie," I said as I sat her by the fire. "Your mother gave herself up to save us. That is the highest form of love. But our job is to make sure that sacrifice isn't in vain. Our job is to fight for the right to be a family. And we won't stop until the truth is heard." I looked at the empty chair where Abigail had sat just an hour before. I felt the tears coming again, but this time they weren't hot. They were cold. They were the tears of a man who was ready for war. The winter wasn't over, not by a long shot. But as I looked at Maggie, I knew one thing for certain. Blackwood Ridge wasn't going to stay silent. Not anymore. We were going to find our voice, and we were going to make the world listen. The trail to Abilene was long. It wasn't just the miles, though they were plenty. It was the weight of what I was carrying. I had Maggie sitting behind me on Rosie, her small arms wrapped tight around my waist. I had Caleb, still mending but upright, following on the roan. And I had a cold, hard knot in my stomach that wouldn't untie. We left the ridge at dawn. I had spent the night packing a small bag and thinking. Thinking is a dangerous thing for a man like me. It leads to questions that don't have easy answers. But as we rode through the slush and the mud, I looked at Maggie. I realized I had to explain things. A child shouldn't have to live in a world that doesn't make sense. Silas? Maggie's voice was small against the wind. Why are we going to see a lawyer? Is he a king? I slowed Rosie to a walk. I wanted the girl to hear me. No, Maggie, I said, a lawyer isn't a king. In this country, we decided a long time ago that we didn't want kings. We wanted something better. We wanted the law. And you need to understand the difference. I adjusted my hat against the glare of the morning sun. A king makes rules to suit his own mood. If he's angry, you suffer. If he's greedy, you lose. But the law is supposed to be an agreement we all make. It's a promise that the truth matters more than who has the biggest house or the sharpest cane. Maggie leaned her head against my back. But Judge Miller has the law, doesn't he? He said Mama had to go. I gripped the reins a little tighter. That is the most important lesson you will ever learn, little bit. There is a difference between the rules and justice. Judge Miller uses the rules like a hammer to break people. But real justice is the spirit behind the rules. It's the belief that every person, man, woman, or child, has a right to their own soul. If a rule is used to take a mother away from her child, then that rule has lost its soul. And a rule without a soul is just a lie dressed up in a fancy suit. We rode on. The highlands began to flatten out into the rolling plains that led to Abilene. It was a different world down there, busier, louder, more people looking for a way to get ahead. We reached the city by the following afternoon. Abilene was a sea of mud and noise. Trains whistled, cattle lowed in the pens. It was a place built on commerce, but tucked away on a side street, near the courthouse, was a small office with a gold leaf sign. Frederick Moss, attorney at law. I hitched the horses. I helped Maggie down. Caleb stayed with the stock, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. He didn't trust the city. I didn't blame him. We walked inside. The office smelled of old tobacco and even older paper. A man sat behind a desk piled high with ledgers. He was older than me, with spectacles perched on the end of a long, thin nose. He looked like a man who spent his life looking for the truth in the fine print. "Mr. Moss?" I asked. The man looked up. He peered over his glasses. "I am. And who might you be, coming into my office looking like you've been dragged through 3 counties of Texas mud?" "My name is Silas Thorne. I'm from Blackwood Ridge, and this is Maggie Sterling." Moss froze. He took his spectacles off. He leaned forward. "Sterling? You know the name?" I asked. Moss didn't answer right away. He stood up and gestured to a couple of chairs. "Sit down, Mr. Thorne, please. I've been waiting 3 years for someone to come through that door and say that name." I sat. Maggie sat beside me, her eyes wide as she took in the wall of books. "I knew Abigail Sterling," Moss said. His voice was different now, respectful. "She wasn't just a clerk in Missouri, Mr. Thorne. She was a witness. A brave one." I felt a jolt of surprise. "What do you mean?" Moss pulled a heavy file from a shelf behind him. He blew the dust off the cover. 3 years ago, there was a family in Presidio County, the Lopez family. They had been on their land for 4 generations, but a man named Harmon Decker, a business associate of your Judge Miller, wanted that land for the railroad. He tried to claim their deed was fraudulent. He used every dirty trick in the book. He opened the file. Abigail was working in the records office then. She found the original land grant. She knew if she brought it forward, she'd lose her job. She knew Julian, her husband, was already deep in debt to Decker and Miller. But she did it anyway. I looked at the papers. I saw Abigail's neat, precise handwriting on a sworn affidavit. She testified, Moss continued. She stood up in a room full of men who wanted her silent, and she spoke the truth. She saved the Lopez family. They kept their home because of her, but Decker and Miller destroyed her for it. They hounded Julian until he fled. They made sure she couldn't find work. They turned the law into a cage to punish her for her honesty. I felt a lump in my throat. I looked at Maggie. You hear that, Maggie? Your mama didn't just save Caleb. She saved a whole family she didn't even know. Moss looked at me. Mr. Thorne, I want you to understand something about the nature of a moral life. Most people think that doing the right thing is its own reward. But in a world run by men like Miller, doing the right thing is a sacrifice. Abigail knew the cost. She paid it, and she never complained. She understood that her integrity was worth more than her comfort. I leaned forward. But Julian is here. He's with Miller. They took her back to town. They claim he has the right of coverture. They claim she's his property. Moss's eyes flashed with a sudden sharp anger. Coverture is a relic, Mr. Thorne. It's a shadow of a darker time. And while it still sits on the books in some places, it cannot override a person's fundamental right to be free from abuse and abandonment. He pulled a document from the file. Look at this. This is the abandonment decree Abigail filed. Julian says he had it suppressed, but he didn't realize she had sent a copy to me for safekeeping. She was smart. She knew the law better than he did. This paper proves that Julian Sterling forfeited his rights as a husband 3 years ago. He has no legal claim to her. None. I felt a surge of hope so strong it made me dizzy. So we can get her back? We can do more than that, Moss said. He stood up and began to pace. We can hold Miller accountable. A judge who knowingly enforces a fraudulent claim is not a judge. He's a criminal. We are going to Abilene Circuit Court. We are going to get an emergency writ of habeas corpus. We are going to demand she be brought before a neutral magistrate. He stopped and looked at me. But I want you to listen to me, Silas. This isn't just about Abigail. This is about the social contract. Do you know what that is? I shook my head. I'm just a rancher, Mr. Moss. It's the invisible cord that holds us together, Moss said. It's the agreement that we give up a little bit of our raw power so that the law can protect everyone. When a man like Miller breaks that contract, he isn't just hurting Abigail. He's unraveling the whole of society. If the law doesn't protect a woman on a ridge, it won't protect a merchant on the street or a farmer in the field. We have a civic duty to fight this, not just for love, but for the survival of our civilization. I stood up. I felt a fire in my blood. Then let's fight. For the next 2 days, we moved through the city like a whirlwind. Moss worked the phones. He worked the telegraph. He woke up judges in the middle of the night. I watched him use the law like a surgeon uses a scalpel, precisely, ruthlessly for the sake of the life inside. And all the while, I talked to Maggie. I wanted her to see the process. I wanted her to know that the world wasn't just made of bullies. See this, Maggie? I said as we sat in the courthouse hallway. This is why we have these big stone buildings. They are meant to be a sanctuary for the truth. It takes a lot of work to make the truth move. It's heavy. It's slow. But once it starts rolling, there isn't a carriage in Texas that can outrun it. Finally, on the 3rd day, Moss walked out of a judge's chamber with a piece of paper in his hand. It had a red wax seal. We have it, Moss said. His voice was weary but triumphant. A writ of attachment. and a warrant for the arrest of Julian Sterling on charges of fraud and kidnapping, and a summons for Judge Miller to appear before the bar of the circuit court. We didn't waste a minute. We headed back toward Driftwood Creek. But we weren't drifters anymore. We were the messengers of the law. As we rode, I felt a strange sense of peace. I realized that Abigail had been right all along. She had been right under that oak tree. She had been right in my kitchen. "Silas?" Maggie asked. "Are we going to fight Julian now?" "No, Maggie," I said. "We aren't going to fight him with our fists. We're going to fight him with the truth. And that's a fight he's never learned how to win. You see, a man like Julian believes that money and power are the only things that are real. He thinks the soul is just a word. But he's about to find out that the soul is the strongest thing there is." I looked at Caleb. He was riding tall in the saddle, his side mended, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He was a man who had spent his life being told the law wasn't for him. But today, he was riding with the law at his back. "Caleb," I said, "you ever think you'd be riding to arrest a judge?" Caleb gave a short, dry laugh. "I thought I'd be buried in the snow, Silas. This is better." "It's more than better, Caleb," I said. "It's right. And right is the only thing that stays warm when the fire goes out. We are standing up for the dignity of a human being. We are saying that a woman's life cannot be stolen. We are declaring that the ridge doesn't belong to Miller's greed, but to the mercy we show one another." As the sun began to set over the highlands, I saw the familiar silhouette of Blackwood Ridge in the distance. It looked like a fortress. It looked like a home. "Abigail," I whispered into the wind, "we're coming, and we're bringing the whole of the law with us." I looked at Maggie. She was smiling. For the first time in a week, she looked like a child again. She wasn't afraid of the shadows. She knew that her mother had been a hero, and she knew that the truth was on its way. "Justice isn't a gift, Maggie," I told her as we crossed the creek. "It is a debt, and today we are going to make sure that debt is paid in full, not for us, but for the sake of the world we're going to leave behind for you." The horse's hooves made a rhythmic sound on the frozen ground. It sounded like a heartbeat. It sounded like a promise. We were the stewards of the ridge. We were the protectors of the healer. And as the stars began to poke through the dark, I knew that the winter was finally starting to break. The light was coming. And this time, it was here to stay. The mud of Driftwood Creek hadn't dried, but it had stiffened. It was a thick, sucking clay that grabbed at the horse's hooves. It felt like the town itself was trying to keep us from reaching the center of things. But we had a different kind of momentum now. We had the law in a leather satchel. I rode Rosie right down the middle of Main Street. Caleb was on my left. Frederick Moss was on my right. Maggie sat behind me, her small hands tucked into my coat pockets. People stopped on the boardwalks. They came out of the saloons and the barber shops. They saw the rancher, the soldier, and the man in the city suit. They saw we weren't coming for supplies. "There," Maggie whispered. She pointed toward the black carriage parked in front of the Miller estate. It was a grand house. White paint, tall pillars, a fence made of iron spikes. It looked like a fortress of old money in a land that was supposed to be new. I climbed down from the saddle. My knees popped and my back ached, but I felt a strange, vibrating energy in my bones. "Caleb, stay with the girl," I said. "Mr. Moss, you're the voice of this party. I'm just the iron." Moss straightened his tie. He gripped his satchel. "Let's go build a bridge for justice, Silas." We walked up the steps. I didn't knock. I pushed the door open. Inside, the air was warm. It smelled of beeswax and expensive brandy. Judge Miller was sitting in a high-backed chair by a fireplace. Julian Sterling was standing by the window, a glass in his hand. And Abigail. She was sitting on a small wooden stool in the corner. She wasn't in the parlor with the men. She was tucked away like a piece of furniture that didn't match the decor. She looked up. When she saw me, her face didn't break. It transformed. It was like watching a lamp being lit in a dark room. "Silas," she breathed. Julian Sterling turned. He didn't look afraid. He looked annoyed. "Thorne, I thought we had an agreement. You're lucky I haven't had the sheriff haul you off for trespassing." Judge Miller stood up, his cane tapping sharply on the Persian rug. "This is an intrusion, Silas. I have a mind to hold you in contempt. Leave this house at once." I didn't say a word. I stepped aside. Frederick Moss stepped forward. He took a single sheet of paper out of his bag. He didn't hand it to them. He held it up like a banner. "I am Frederick Moss," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it filled the room. It had the weight of the circuit court in every syllable. "And I am here to inform you that the agreement you coerced is a legal nullity. I have here a writ of habeas corpus signed by Justice Henderson in Abilene, and I have a warrant for the arrest of Julian Sterling on charges of fraud, suppression of legal documents, and kidnapping." Julian's glass hit the floor. It didn't shatter, it just thudded on the thick rug. The brandy soaked into the wool like a blood stain. Miller's face went white. "Henderson has no jurisdiction here. This is my valley." "No, Judge," Moss said. He stepped closer. "This is a republic. And in a republic, no man owns a valley. We have a system of checks and balances for a reason. You thought you could be the king of this ridge because you sat on a tall chair. But you forgot the most basic principle of our society. The law belongs to the people, not to the magistrate. To use your office to help a man steal his wife's freedom is a high crime. It is a betrayal of the public trust." I walked over to Abigail. I reached out my hand. She took it. Her palm was cold, but her grip was steady. "Come on, Abigail," I whispered. "We're going home." Julian tried to step in my way. "She's my wife, by the law of Missouri." "The law of Missouri doesn't exist here, Julian," I said. I looked him dead in the eye. "And neither does your claim. You abandoned her. You forfeited your rights when you chose your debts over your family. You see, a marriage isn't a bill of sale, it's a covenant. And a covenant requires both sides to show up. You left the table 3 years ago. You don't get to come back now and claim the feast." I looked at Miller. "And you, Judge. You talked a lot about order. But I want you to hear this, for the sake of the men who will come after you. Order without justice is just a fancy name for a cage. You wanted a quiet town. But a quiet town that ignores the cries of a mother is a graveyard for the soul. We are taking her back to the ridge. And if you send anyone after us, they'll be answering to the circuit court, not your gavel." We walked out. We walked out past the iron fence. We walked out past the staring neighbors. I helped Abigail onto Rosie. I climbed up behind her. We rode out of Driftwood Creek, and for the first time in 6 years, I didn't feel like I was fleeing. I felt like I was leading a parade. The ridge was waiting for us. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. The news of the rescue had traveled fast. But something else happened. The people of the valley, the ones who had been quiet, the ones who had been afraid, started to find their spines. A family arrived at the ranch one afternoon. It was the Lopez family from Presidio. They had traveled 3 days just to say thank you. They brought a goat. They brought sacks of corn. And they brought the news that Julian Sterling had fled the territory before the sheriff could find him. Judge Miller had resigned his post for health reasons, which was just a polite way of saying the law was breathing down his neck. But the real work was happening on the ridge. We decided to do it on a Saturday. The April sun was warm enough to melt the last of the deep drifts. The grass was starting to peek through, a pale, brave green. I stood on the ridge, under the big oak tree where it had all started. I was wearing my best shirt. My boots were polished. Caleb stood beside me, looking proud in his old uniform. Hector and the Lopez family were there. Even old Lady Henderson had come up, bringing a cake and an apology. Then I saw her. Abigail came out of the house. She wasn't wearing a rag. She was wearing a dress of soft blue wool that we had ordered from Abilene. Maggie was beside her, wearing a matching sash. They looked like the sky had come down to earth. We didn't have a preacher. We didn't want the words of a man who had stayed silent during the winter. We wanted to speak for ourselves. We stood in a circle. The wind was soft. It smelled of damp earth and new life. "Abigail," I said. I took her hands. I spent a lot of my life thinking that being alone was the only way to stay safe. I thought that if I didn't love anyone, I couldn't lose anyone. But you taught me that a life without love is just a slow way of dying. You showed me that we have a moral obligation to be brave for one another. I looked at the people gathered there. We are standing here to make a commitment. But I want everyone to understand what we are committing to. This isn't about ownership. It isn't about Abigail becoming my property or Maggie becoming my charge. It is about the right to choose who we walk beside. Abigail looked at me. Her eyes were clear. She didn't look like a ghost anymore. "Silas, you followed a starving woman into the cold because you believed in her dignity. You saw the person when the world saw a problem. And you taught me that it is a human right to be seen, to be heard, to be valued." She squeezed my hands. "I choose you, not because I need a roof, though the roof is good. Not because I need a protector, though you are strong. I choose you because you are a man who understands that love is an act of the will. It is a daily decision to treat another person with the same respect you want for yourself. That is the highest law there is." I pulled a small ring from my pocket. It was a simple band of gold. "In this life," I said, "we have a duty to be stewards of the hearts we are given. To be a husband or a wife isn't a title of power. It is a title of service. It means I will stand between you and the wind. It means I will share the last crust of bread with you, not out of pity, but out of the truth that your hunger is my hunger. We are partners. We are equals. And in this house, that will always be the law." I slid the ring onto her finger. "I promise to honor your mind," I said. "I promise to listen to your voice. And I promise to build a world for Maggie, where she never has to beg for her place at the table, because a society is measured by how it treats its children. And we are going to make sure she knows she belongs to herself and to this family in that order." Maggie ran up then. She didn't wait for a signal. She grabbed both of our hands. "Are we a family now?" she asked. "We've been a family since the night of the blizzard, Maggie," Abigail said. She knelt down and hugged the girl. "A family isn't made of papers or blood alone. It's made of the promises we keep. It's made of the way we look out for each other when the world gets cold. We are a family because we chose to be. And that is the strongest bond there is." We spent the rest of the day on the ridge. We ate, we laughed. We watched the sun dip behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors of fire and gold. I sat on the porch with Abigail as the stars began to come out. Caleb was playing a harmonica down by the barn. The sound was thin and sweet, a melody of peace. "You know, Silas," Abigail said, leaning her head on my shoulder, "I never thought a malban mi, a crust of bread, could lead to all of this." "It wasn't the bread, Abigail," I said. It was the mercy behind it. You see, the world tries to tell us that we should look out for ourselves. It tells us that we should hoard what we have and let the weak fall. But that's a lie that leads to a lonely death. The truth is that we are all connected. When you suffered, a part of me suffered. When you were restored, I was restored. I looked at the dark silhouette of the oak tree. That is the lesson of this ridge. We are not just individuals wandering in the brush. We are a community of souls. And we have a civic and a moral duty to lift each other up. If we don't do that, then the land is just dirt and the house is just wood. But when we care for one another, the dirt becomes a home and the wood becomes a sanctuary." Abigail nodded. "It's a heavy lesson, Silas. Most people go their whole lives without learning it." "Then we'll keep teaching it," I said. "We'll teach it to Maggie. We'll teach it to the children who come to our school. We'll teach them that the greatest power they have isn't a gun or a pile of gold. It's the ability to see the humanity in the person standing next to them. If they learn that, then the Millers and the Julians of the world will never be able to touch them." The moon rose over the highlands. It was a bright silver coin. It lit up the trail we had walked so many times. "I love you, Abigail Thorne," I whispered. "And I love you, Silas," she replied. We sat there in the silence. It wasn't the silence of 1872. It wasn't the silence of the ghosts. It was the silence of a house that was finally full. The winter had been long, the trials had been many. But we had found the truth, and the truth had built us a fortress that the wind could never shake. "The soul is a free thing, Abigail," I said as we stood up to go inside. "And today, we finally gave it a place to rest." She turned the key in the door, but she didn't lock it. She left it open for the light. And as we stepped into the warmth of the hearth, I knew that the story of the lonely cowboy and the starving girl wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. It was the start of a legacy of mercy that would outlive us all. On Blackwood Ridge, the bread was shared, the books were read, and the heart was finally home. And for a man who had started with nothing but a bay mare and a broken spirit, that was the greatest miracle of all. The stars shone down on the Texas highlands, bright and constant. They didn't care about the laws of men. They only cared about the light. And on that ridge, for the first time in a decade, the light was brighter than the dark. The wind had changed. It was softer now. It didn't have the bite it used to, or maybe I had just grown a thicker skin over the last 10 years. It was April 1888, and the Texas highlands were wearing a coat of green that looked like it would last forever. I sat on the porch of the house on Blackwood Ridge. I was 52 now. My hair had gone the color of a winter sky, and my knees told me about the rain 2 days before it arrived. But my heart? My heart was lighter than it had been since I was a boy. Down the hill, the Sterling Thorne schoolhouse stood white and proud against the pines. It wasn't a big building, just one room with a bell tower and a wide porch. But it was the most important piece of timber in the valley. I watched the door open. A swarm of children spilled out into the afternoon sun. They were a patchwork of the world. There were the Henderson boys, tall and lanky. There were the Lopez children, quick and laughing. And there were the 3 Miller kids. Not the judge's kin, but the family of the man who had taken over the smithy, and there in the middle of it all was Abigail. She was 44 now. She moved with a grace that the years hadn't touched. She stood on the steps, her hands on her hips, watching the children run. She looked like a woman who had finally found the place where she was supposed to be. I stood up and walked down the trail to meet her. My pace was rhythmic, slow, steady, like a man who knew exactly where he was going. "Class is out early," I said as I reached the school steps. Abigail smiled. She wiped a smudge of chalk from her cheek. "They finished their compositions, Silas, and the sun was too beautiful to keep locked behind a desk. There is an education in the light that a book can't always capture." She looked at the children playing tag in the meadow. "Listen to me, Silas," she said. "I told them something today that I want them to carry until they are as old as we are. I told them that the true purpose of an education isn't to get a better job or to make more money. The true purpose is to develop the capacity for empathy. A person who can read but cannot feel for their neighbor is just a clever monster. We are teaching them to be human beings first, and scholars second." I nodded. I watched a young boy trip and fall, and before he could even cry, one of the older girls was there to brush him off. "That is the civic duty of a teacher," Abigail continued, "to show these children that they are part of a larger whole. I told them that a community is not a collection of fences. It is a collection of hands. If one hand is empty, the whole body is weaker for it. To live only for oneself is a violation of the social contract that keeps us all safe." We walked back up toward the ranch house. Caleb was by the barn working on a new harness. He was a partner in the ranch now. We didn't call it hiring anymore. We called it stewardship. "Caleb," I called out, "you coming up for supper?" "In a minute, Silas," he replied. He stood tall, his side fully healed, his eyes bright. "I'm just finishing this leather. A man owes it to the animal to give it equipment that doesn't pinch. Respect for the creature is the start of respect for the world." We went inside. The house smelled of roasted chicken and herbs. Maggie was at the table. She was 16 now. She had Abigail's eyes and my stubborn jaw. She had a heavy book open in front of her, Gray's Anatomy. She was leaving for the East in the fall, to a medical college for women. It was costing a small fortune in cattle and timber, but I would have sold the ridge itself to pay for it. "Maggie," I said, sitting down across from her, "why do you want to spend your life looking at bones and blood? It's a hard path for a woman." Maggie looked up. Her voice was steady. It was rhythmic, just like her mother's. "Because, Silas, the body is the ultimate frontier of justice. When a person is sick, they are at their most vulnerable. And in that vulnerability, they have a fundamental right to be treated with dignity, regardless of who they are. I watched Mama save Caleb. I watched her treat people that the real doctors wouldn't touch. I realized then that health care is a human right, not a privilege for those with a pedigree." She closed the book. "I want to go where the need is greatest. I want to prove that a healer's hands are defined by their skill and their mercy, not by their gender. To deny a person the chance to heal is a waste of the talent God gave them. And to deny a patient the best care possible is a crime against the sanctity of life." Abigail set a plate of bread on the table. It was a fresh loaf, warm, fragrant. "That is the legacy we are building, Silas," Abigail said. She sat down and took my hand. "We are raising a generation that understands that their value is not tied to their property or their name. It is tied to their contribution to the common good. We are teaching them that love is an active choice. It is a decision to stand up for the truth, even when the truth is unpopular." We ate our supper. We talked about the ranch. We talked about the school. We talked about the new railroad spur coming to the valley and how we would have to fight to make sure the small landholders didn't get cheated. "Progress is a double-edged sword, Silas," Abigail said. "It brings technology, but it can also bring a new kind of greed. We have a moral obligation to be the watchman. We must ensure that progress doesn't mean leaving the poor behind in the dust of the tracks. A society that moves fast but leaves its soul behind is just a machine heading for a wreck." After supper, Maggie went to her room to pack some books. Abigail and I went out to the porch. We sat in the rockers, the rhythmic creak of the wood a comfort against the silence of the evening. The moon rose. It was a silver sliver, just like the night I followed her to the oak tree. 10 years, Silas," Abigail whispered. "The best 10 years of my life," I said. "I remember that day by the creek. I remember the tears. I thought the world was ending, but it was just being born." I looked at her. "I learned a hard lesson back then, Abigail. I learned that we are all just one bad winter away from needing a crust of bread. And that realization should make us kinder, not harder. It should make us realize that our strength is a loan, and we owe interest on it every single day in the form of mercy." Abigail leaned her head on my shoulder. "Yes. And I learned that being saved isn't about someone doing the work for you. It's about someone giving you the ground to stand on, so you can do the work yourself. You gave me that ground, Silas. You gave me the right to be a whole person again." I looked out over the dark valley. I saw the lights of the other ranches. I saw the faint glow of the town. "Listen to me, Abigail," I said. "People will tell this story one day. They'll call it a romance. They'll call it a legend of the West. But I hope they see the truth of it. I hope they see that it was a story about the rights of the soul. I hope they see that it was about the duty we have to protect the dignity of our fellow man." I took a deep breath of the pine-scented air. A human being is not a commodity. A woman is not an ornament. A child is not a burden. We are all sovereign entities, and the only legitimate law is the one that recognizes that freedom. If we forget that, we forget everything. The silence of the ridge was deep. It was peaceful. It was the silence of a debt paid in full. We shared the bread, didn't we, Silas? We did, Abigail, every last crumb, and somehow the more we shared, the more we seemed to have. We sat there as the stars turned overhead. They were constant. They were bright. They were the same stars that had seen the starving girl and the lonely cowboy. But tonight, they were seeing something else. They were seeing a sanctuary. "Good night, Silas," Abigail whispered. "Good night, Abigail," I replied. We went inside and turned the key, but as always we left the lamp in the window. We left it for the next traveler. We left it for the next soul looking for a reason to keep walking, because on Blackwood Ridge the light was never for us alone. It was a right. It was a promise. And it was never ever going to go out. The story was finished. But the life? The life was just beginning. And in the 1888 Texas Highlands, that was the only truth that mattered. The lonely cowboy had followed the girl. He had wept. He had fought. And in the end, he had found that the greatest frontier wasn't the land. It was the capacity of the human heart to hold the world. And for Silas Thorne, that was enough. That was everything. This channel brings you stories of Western cowboys, frontier love, motherly devotion, human kindness, compassion, and the unbreakable bonds between people. The lesson of this story is simple. True strength is not found in power, money, or pride, but in the courage to see another person's suffering and choose mercy. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe so more souls can ride with us into the heart of the West. This book is a work of imagination. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's creativity or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is unintentional and should not be construed as factual representation.
In the end, this story is not only about a lonely cowboy, a starving mother, and a little girl searching for warmth in the merciless winter of the West. It is a story about the kind of kindness that does not ask for applause, the kind of love that gives even when there is almost nothing left to give, and the kind of courage that rises when ordinary people refuse to bow before cruelty. Silas Thorne thought he was only offering Abigail and Maggie a roof, a meal, and a safe place to rest. But what he truly offered them was dignity. And in return they gave him something just as precious, a reason to open his heart again after years of grief. From one small crust of bread came a chain of mercy, sacrifice, justice, and healing. That is the power of compassion. It may begin quietly, with one hand reaching out to another, but it can grow strong enough to challenge a whole town, a corrupt judge, and every cold-hearted rule that says some people matter less than others. The lesson of this story is that human worth is never measured by wealth, status, strength, or the approval of society. Abigail was poor, hungry, and abandoned, but she was never worthless. Maggie was only a child, but her hunger, her fear, and her future mattered. Caleb was dismissed by cruel men, but his life was sacred, and Silas, though broken by loss, still had goodness inside him, waiting to be awakened. This story reminds us that every person deserves to be seen, heard, protected, and treated with respect. True justice is not merely written in law books. It lives in the choices we make when someone weaker than us needs help. True strength is not found in domination, pride, or revenge, but in mercy, patience, and the courage to stand beside those who have been pushed aside. Most of all, this tale teaches us that love is not just a feeling. Love is an action. A mother giving her last bite of food to her child is love. A grieving cowboy opening his home to strangers is love. A woman risking everything to protect her daughter is love. A community learning to speak up against injustice is love. And sometimes, love means fighting. Not with hatred in the heart, but with truth, faith, and a refusal to let cruelty have the final word. On the harsh frontier, where the wind could freeze a man's bones and loneliness could harden his soul, these characters discovered that the warmest fire is not always in the hearth. Sometimes It burns in the human heart when compassion becomes stronger than fear. So as we leave Blackwood Ridge behind, let us remember this. A single act of kindness can change the path of many lives. A shared meal can become a new beginning. A safe room can become a sanctuary. A broken man can become whole again. And a mother's love can become a light powerful enough to guide everyone home. May this story remind us to look more gently at the people around us, to listen before we judge, to help before we turn away, and to understand that in this hard world, we survive not by standing alone, but by caring for one another. That is the heart of the West. And that is the heart of this story.